nonprofits and the people behind them and around them. Casey Cares is the intersection of the nonprofit and profit communities, making Kansas City a better place to live, work, and play. This Casey Cares segment is brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, www.kauffman.org. I'm Ruth Baum-Biggis. Those who toil in the nonprofit arena, both professionals, lay leaders, and volunteers, even students, always have the opportunity to learn more. No one knows that better than Dr. David Renz. He's Director Emeritus for the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. A regular guest on this Casey Cares podcast, Dr. Renz is also an academician, sharing his insights, his knowledge, and wisdom on the nonprofit sector. Today, David Renz is joining us to talk about his latest project, co-editing the latest edition of the Jossey-Bass Handbook of Nonprofit Leadership and Management. This important tool shares insights from more than 30 leading writers and researchers in the field on a wide range of topics from governance and leadership, branding, advocacy, and much more. Well, Dr. Renz, welcome back. It's been a little while, and now we know why.
Well, we've been busy, and a lot of things have happened in your side of the world and mine too.
Well, tell us about this book and what this book kind of means in the global world of nonprofits.
Well, I'm pleased to do that. I am not the founder of this book. Our colleague at UMKC, Bob Herman, created this book in 1994, the first edition of this thing called the Jossey-Bass Handbook of Nonprofit Leadership and Management. It was the first most comprehensive book on nonprofit leadership and management at the time, and in many respects, it still is. The book that just came out is the fifth edition. Bob edited the first two. Bob retired and asked if I would pick the mantle and move ahead with it. I did for the third, fourth, and frankly, I was a little surprised. I semi-retired a couple of years ago in 2020 from my academic roles, my formal ones, and kind of assumed that in today's digital world, the book market had shifted a bit. And so I was a little surprised a year and a half ago when Wiley Publishing contacted me and said, "Don't you think it's time?" The last one was 2016. And this thing is still selling, but people want to know when the new one's coming. Because, of course, the environment does change. And of course, the world has changed incredibly widely since 2016, even before we got to the pandemic phase and all of that. So they indicated that in the little tiny niche that we occupy, this book is something of a bestseller, which is, it's a pleasure to hear that, of course, that they want you to be doing these things. Part of the reason it's a bestseller is because it's a book it is indeed a handbook, so it's very comprehensive. I sometimes do admit to folks that it's one of the best doorstops you can find because it's nearly 800 pages. But
wow,
as you said, the book covers an entire range of leadership and management topics, and I'm proud to say it's used probably in 85 to 90% of the graduate nonprofit management programs, graduate school programs across the country. So it gets out and about, and our academic colleagues follow it. But it's intended, and I'm very proud to say that it is being used not only by folks who are students and then graduate, but they keep the book. It's always great when a book that they have to read for school is actually something somebody keeps because they said, "Oh, that might be useful anyway." Or, I mean, in addition. So, and I was pleased. The publishers always hammer on you to engage in social media and let the world know that these things are out and all that. So, I'm not a very effective social media influencer or a user, but I put post out on Facebook and a post out on Handbook, or on LinkedIn rather, which is the only spaces I pay much attention to. And I was just delighted. I got about 500 responses and comments, and about 40 or 50 of my former students here at UMKC wrote back and said, I'll go buy the new one. I'm still using the last one we used in class. So, I'm very proud of the fact that it's actually a resource. It uh, it uh, it addresses many of the questions, and of course, the opportunity and challenge after 8 years or 7 years when we started rewriting this book is the world's changed a bit for the nonprofit. I mean, for everybody, but for nonprofits as well.
Well, change indeed. Time moves on and marches on, as we all know. But then we came into this global pandemic. Then we've come out of this global pandemic. Not being an author of a textbook or a handbook, how far out do you have to work? And then how quickly then can you get it out in people's hands?
Well, that's a good question. The book, which literally was physically produced, I received it 3 weeks ago in physical form. Those files were submitted to the publisher in August, and then you go through editing and revision so you can update things a bit. Candidly, I wrote the introduction and the conclusion, which are more. By the way, this is an edited volume, so I did not write everything in here. I'm proud to say I have a couple of chapters that are mine and a couple that I've written with Bob Herman, but we've drawn on, and that's part of what makes it a great resource. I keep pointing over here because it's on the desk. It's a great resource because we've drawn on a huge array of authors from around the country, but frankly, this issue, the edition that we just issued, is much more inclusive globally. It still doesn't have much representation from African authors, a little bit from Asian authors, but we really worked hard to be more broadly inclusive in a lot of different ways, including geographically. So the downside of that, of course, is we started writing some of these authors in Europe and around the country back in, it was really had to be 2022. And people prepared stuff, but everybody submitted their materials, and we then ran final statistics at the end of the summer and early fall. And then I wrote the conclusion after reading the latest reports of 2023. So, the data reflects things, including, I was just going back to check on some of it. One of the real challenges in the nonprofit sector and across the economy overall is workforce and employment. And so the most recent reports were probably April and May of 2023. So even though, there's lead time, almost a year, but it does reflect quite current information. It doesn't have any data from 2024 because it was in the middle of the printing press by that time.
That's pretty amazing. I'm pleased to hear that it's that quote unquote, real time. I would have thought even further out. And so you were able to address things like the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. All right, well, let's dive into some of the topics that you all looked at and maybe the biggest surprises, the biggest changes that you found.
Well, I don't, because these things are progressing over time, and candidly, we really wrote the proposal for this toward the end of what seems like the end of the worst of the pandemic. And frankly, as is especially critical for our audience, the pandemic had a huge impact, but it also had a huge impact in two key areas, workforce and workforce coming back to work. And that, of course, varied hugely across the nonprofit sector. We think of the nonprofit sector as a thing, and sometimes it is, but of course within the nonprofit sector you have entities as varied as organizations that not only kept operating but were ramped up hugely during the pandemic, the healthcare institutions and the healthcare outreach organizations, all those kinds of places. And then you had the part of the nonprofit sector, the performing arts, where a key part of the revenue model, the business, is putting folks in seats, and they weren't allowed to even open the doors, and so nobody could come in. And that, of course, had a huge impact on on revenue, but it also had a huge impact on the workforce. And of course, the phenomenon of the of the workforce that we've heard about for the whole economy, at first it was kind of called the Great Reset, and then, it's kind of like, well, what is that? A lot of people did treat it as a reset, and frankly, a lot of nonprofits ended up having to. So part of what was interesting was to see how nonprofits are trying to be more responsive and this sounds a little strange, but in a sense, more respectful of the human talent, both paid and volunteer, that is so central to making the sector perform in the ways that we count on and need. And so, like a good share of American employers, nonprofits were having trouble getting folks to come back to work. A lot of people who were close to retirement or close to stepping out to do something else in their careers as the pandemic emerged, kind of just said, okay, I guess I made it through that part. I guess I can stay out. So the segments of the nonprofit sector are doing well, but huge segments of the sector, including some of the ones we care. Well, I shouldn't say we care most about. We care about all of them, but we're most reliant for core human life and health conditions. The healthcare organizations are still struggling terribly with bringing enough people back. That has the chicken and egg part of that, which was part of what was fascinating to look at, is how are nonprofits, probably later than I wish, but how are they actually thinking more carefully about caring for the workforce? We've always had compensation challenges throughout much of the nonprofit sector, but salary pressures, compensation pressures are significant. Frankly, there is a huge range of appreciation, if you will, among citizens in society with regard to compensating nonprofits. There are the people of nonprofits. Some people figure, well, you're a nonprofit, therefore, why should we be paying you? It's kind of like, well, the people who are doing the work of the nonprofits as employees, this is their livelihood. And one of the things that not everybody agrees with me about, but I've for a very long time complained about nonprofits that can't afford to and won't pay their staff adequately. They're exploiting their workforce in the name of the mission. And we need to get beyond that. People deserve to be paid a fair wage. Nobody's getting rich in the nonprofit world, or essentially nobody is. And there's no stock in the nonprofit world, so you certainly don't have stock options or any of these other huge inflators that are out in the private for-profit sector. So the workforce dynamics and really paying a lot more attention to well-being of the people in the nonprofit organizations, that is really critical because the pandemic took a huge toll for those who were able to or had to continue to work. Healthcare, human services, emergency assistance, at the community level around homelessness and houselessness, just food and those kinds of basics. The stresses on those folks have taken a huge toll, and that is that's been a real problem. And so nonprofits are increasingly trying to be more thoughtful about this. But the truth is they're still struggling with the financial challenges, and frankly, just the workforce overall. You've got a lot of people who ironically are so committed and so passionately into the missions of their organization that they kind of or literally do burn out. And for those fields that work, especially in traumatic care, whether it's physical or mental health areas, we're seeing some real serious concerns. And so paying attention to that is a significant factor. Of course, one of the things that played out early in the pandemic, and we knew we needed to write about it, but it was going to be interesting to try to figure out more about how and what to say, are all of the issues around social justice, equity, and engagement in communities, issues of that sort. And that, of course, has been fascinating to watch because you've seen a lot of attention to it early on. A lot of foundations shifted a lot of their foundation giving to social justice initiatives and causes, which ironically has resulted in underfunding or loss of funding for some of our most important community-based agencies. They just, just kind of, I mean, most foundations didn't like walk away overnight, but what they did was shift their giving down in those mission areas because they were trying to work in improving, equity and addressing needs in communities of color and other grassroots communities. So now, of course, what we're seeing right at this point in time is a backlash across many parts of America around diversity, equity, inclusion programming. And, it's been interesting and sometimes concerning to see how this plays out because there's such misunderstanding. One of the things we were able to do, I don't know that it'll be the kind of exciting reading that people will jump to right away in the book, but we added, I mean, this is a theme that went through much of what we were talking about in the book, but we added a chapter specifically that's research based on how do we actually grow equity, inclusion, and engagement in ways that are organizationally responsible. They're not just popularity wave kinds of things. They're really grounded in appropriate social, psychological, sociological dynamics and understanding where and how we can really make lasting change that is about equity and engagement and inclusion, as opposed to what, unfortunately, I think has gotten a lot of the backlash, which is sometimes the flavor of the month kind of programming that some places have adopted just because somebody told them they had to or they thought it looked good on their marketing. So I'm kind of rattling on here, but
no, but rather than taking the deeper dive into what that issue means, et cetera. You mentioned, I know in the book, there's areas of technology, competition, effectiveness, demographic shifts, trust. Give us some highlights of some of those things that you've observed. And then I guess the follow-up question would be, and what should we do about them?
Yeah. Well, I'll save the one that concerns me the most for my second or third point, because you've tossed a couple of different things in there. One of the things that I'm just not wired to think about this stuff very well. And Ruth, I apologize because you are, but I'm not too much in the marketing and all of that space. And where I am, it tends to be around advocacy and communication and education, as opposed to some of the other things. As I already owned up to, I am a serious underperformer when it comes to social media. But I knew we had to we had to highlight in this book, because in the 8 years since the previous edition, the social media space, the communication space, all of that has changed hugely. So, by the way, one of the chapters in this book, which is about marketing, but the core theme of the author of that, not me, is actually the anatomy of a brand, of a nonprofit brand. It's about nonprofit branding and communication. We did update the advocacy chapter, trying to always help nonprofits understand the imperative of communicating. And a lot of people mistakenly think advocacy is primarily or all about lobbying and political action. Well, it is in a sense, but if you're doing it well, it's actually grassroots. It's about getting the word out about your mission. And of course, if you're dealing with issues that are under-recognized or underappreciated in our communities, you've got even more of an advocacy job, because you have to help people understand, why the heck would I care about this? And what would I do to support this organization or that if we were in it? So, social justice organizations need it, but so, by the way, to healthcare. So, by the way, to literacy organizations. It's relevant to everybody. So we put in the update. The new author on that chapter focused particularly on on branding and the nature of branding to really do it in a more sophisticated and substantive way so that it makes a difference in what actually is one of the other real critical problems you alluded to it a minute ago, which is trust in the sector and trust in nonprofits. And this is really concerning me a lot. Now, if you want to see the glass half full, the good news is the nonprofit sector and nonprofits are still trusted by a larger share of the population in the U.S., actually even a little bit more because we've worked very hard to include European statistics and some other parts of the world in this edition of the handbook. Nonprofits are more trusted in Europe than they are trusted in the sense of a larger share of the population in Europe than they are in the United States now. That said, depending on the survey or studies that you're looking at, about half to 60% of Americans trust nonprofits to do the right thing. The sense of some people, and this gets back into another kind of advocacy, the sense of some people is, well, nonprofits are nicer places, but they're not as efficiently run, which is a bizarre twist. Now, the book pushes this a lot, but if anybody is squeezing more power and impact out of a nickel, it's got to be our colleagues throughout the nonprofit sector. But trust and trust issues are what they are. And of course, they have an impact on the financial model as well, and a lot of people think this is the only source of money in the sector, which is not true. But a key chunk of resources to the sector come from philanthropy. They come from giving. And so, the statistics show 40 to 60% of Americans trust nonprofits a lot. One of the things that's interesting to me, and one of the reports I pulled into our discussion in the conclusion of the book, was in 22 and 23, these studies, one was done by a group called Independent Sector, one by the Lilly School of Philanthropy at the University of Indiana, another couple more. And actually, there's a global thing called the Edelman Trust Barometer, which is an annual report of trust in institutions across the world, and then sliced by nation, so you can compare which nations trust more versus less, or the populations of those nations trust more or less. One of the things that we found, you're going to be shocked to hear this, Ruth, but it turns out people who don't know a lot about the nonprofit sector don't trust it as much as people who know a lot about the nonprofit sector. That's why we've got this show. That's why you've got your work.
Surprise.
Yeah, so good news there. Here's the bad news. 63% of the population says they know very little or nothing about the nonprofit sector. And by the way, that 63%, only about 20 to 25% of those folks trust the nonprofit. This isn't really shocking, but they don't trust the nonprofit sector to really make much difference or do anything important. And so, when you think about advocacy, when you think about philanthropy, just helping people better understand what's going on in their communities, this is a really significant issue to me. And it influences everything else. Now, the irony, part of the irony to me, and your whole show and everything you do highlights the absurdity of this. But if the majority of Americans know little or nothing, by their own statement in a survey, about the nonprofit sector, and yet every one of them is actively involved in at least a couple of nonprofit activities and initiatives every year. They're served by them or whatever. So this is why the head part of me, because my natural inclination doesn't go this way, but this business, we got to up our game when it comes to telling or connecting and engaging. I guess telling is the wrong word, because just telling people, hey, you ought to think this way, that works really well. So, we really need to help people, we collectively in the sector, but especially the segments that are less visible. They're behind the scenes actors. The world doesn't work without them, and people don't even know that their livelihood and quality of life is fundamentally affected by these creatures. And so many of them are very small grassroots organizations, which is part of the challenge. One of the things that has not changed is that there's 1.5 million charitable nonprofits in America, about 1.5 million right now, as of about 2022. That's the most recent data, and only about a third of them have budgets that exceed $1 million in size. 66% of them have budgets of less than $50,000 a year. These are the true community-based nonprofit organizations. It's kind of like, well, how do you do anything with that little money? Well, the way you do it is with volunteers, and you've got some paid staff, ideally, hopefully not many. If you're only operating on $50,000 a year, you can't be paying many people fairly to do much. But this is the balancing act. And so, a lot of people want nonprofits to perform very effectively, and they compare them to for-profits that are much larger. And one of the ironies that our research simply affirmed in this edition of the book as well is that dollar for dollar in budget size, it is substantially harder to manage a nonprofit and enable it to be effective and successful than it is a for-profit business. And that's because the workforce is more complicated. You've got this mix of paid people and volunteers. And part of what you have to do is not even people who are in your organization, but you need to motivate them, encourage them. And the money part of it, the financial models for nonprofits are substantially more complicated. The 1/5 of the book is a set of chapters that just hone in on individual categories of financial sources. One is on philanthropy, but another is on government funding, and the challenges of government funding.
Right.
A couple of the chapters are about earned income, whether it's selling seats in your theater or selling products in the community that you use to subsidize the more charitable things that you're doing as well. So it's the package is part of what's so fascinating, and it's gotten. I hate to say this candidly, in a public program, but it just owning it for what it is. It's really harder than it looks to lead and manage a nonprofit organization, and we need to attract more folks into the sector who really, are going to be able to carry it forward. By the way, that implies one of the real challenges, which is the transition in the workforce, the succession.
Right.
I was just reading a report literally this morning that has documented that the arts and culture segment of the workforce in America actually has rebounded to employment levels that are comparable to what they were pre-pandemic. Healthcare, no. Emergency support, homelessness, emergency assistance organizations, they're still running. They're running with deficits in the number of folks in their paid ranks, and they are also operating with fewer volunteers per client served, if you will, than has been the case.
Your book is packed. Before we run out of time here, real quickly, where is the best place for folks to find the book?
Well, if you actually Google it, you'll find it. Wiley Publishing promotes it pretty actively. In the digital space, you can go to Amazon. Frankly, I did Google the name of the book a few weeks ago, actually before it was actually in print, and I was surprised to find that you can buy it at Target, not in the store, but Target.
There you go.
But Amazon is probably the largest single purveyor of the book, and so you can get it from there. I do want to highlight one of the things that we really worked hard on as we brought this new edition. It's not absolutely new, but we expanded it substantially, is to put a significant package of online resources to support each of the chapters. And you can actually go online and get access to those without buying the book. And so, every chapter created an annotated website bibliography. So you can go to entities that have, for example, reports on the sector or tools for financial management, things like that. I've tried to vet the best of what I think those websites are that are out there. And so you can download those bibliographies, you can get access to some tools and worksheets. Educators can get access to some other things they can use in classes, but it's a so-called premium resources site that's available just to support readers of the book.
Do you have a URL for that or a website you can send us to? If not, we'll get it and we'll post it.
Yeah, I don't have it in my head because it's a Wiley site that's a little bit screwy, but I'll send
a little convoluted. We'll be sure to put that on our Facebook page. David, as always, oodles and oodles of great information. We would encourage people to consider checking out this book, keeping it as a handbook. Whether you're a student, whether you're working, well, aren't we all students all the time when we work in nonprofits? But I mean, at the university versus out working. It's the Jossey-Bass Handbook of Nonprofit Leadership and Management. David, thank you again for your time and your wisdom.
Pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much for your interest.
Thank you for joining us for KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We are produced by Charitable Communications, and this episode was brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. Don't forget, you can catch us Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. on ESPN 1510 AM and 94.5 FM. Thank you for joining us on KC Cares.